August 1, 1944, a crossroads on the southern edge of Avranches, France, at the hinge of the entire Normandy front. 3 German formations, remnants of the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division Götz von Berlichingen, and the shattered 5th Parachute Division had been ordered to hold this ground. Their commanders were not amateurs. These were veterans with years of professional soldiering behind them, men who had passed through the brutal selection process of the German General Stab, who understood armor and terrain and the geometry of armored war the way surgeons understand anatomy. Not from textbooks alone, but from years of performing the operation under pressure with lives on the table. They had maps. German operational maps were among the finest produced by any military in the world. Detailed, precise, updated by Luftwaffe aerial reconnaissance, annotated with supply routes, road conditions, bridge load capacities, and the location of fuel stocks to the nearest kilometer. A German staff officer's map was not a decoration. It was the mind of the operation made visible on paper. And those maps told them something unambiguous. The road south of Avranches, and more critically, the long pivot east through the Bocage toward Le Mans, and ultimately toward Paris, could not sustain a major armored thrust. The terrain permitted it, the roads allowed it, but the fuel did not. A Panzer IV Ausf. H consumed 7.4 liters of fuel per kilometer moving cross-country. Standard capacity, 470 liters. Operational radius under combat conditions. Roughly 63 kilometers before the tank became a steel pillbox. Every German staff officer knew this number by memory. It was the first principle of their operational world. Here is the strange detail that German field reports from August and September 1944 would record with a bewilderment that professional soldiers almost never committed to paper. American armor began materializing from directions that, by every calculation in every German staff manual, required a tank force to consume more fuel than its own combined vehicle weight could carry. Not more than their tanks could hold, more than the tanks physically weighed. By the 3rd week of August 1944, General George Patton's Third Army had covered 400 miles of French terrain in 17 days, fighting continuously, at a rate of advance that German logistics officers calculated was geometrically impossible by a factor of 3. And when Patton complained to his superiors, he was not complaining about the enemy. He was complaining that his supply deliveries had fallen short by 100,000 gallons of fuel in a single day, because his army had moved faster than even the American logistics system had been designed to follow. Here is the sentence that explains how. Part 1. The arithmetic of their confidence. The German army was, in the professional estimation of its enemies, and by the cold arithmetic of battlefield performance across 6 years of war, the finest ground combat force of the Second World War. Write that sentence down before continuing, because every part of what follows depends on your willingness to sit with it. The German military was not a monster stumbling forward on ideology. It was a precision instrument built by a culture that had turned the study of war into something approaching a systematic science, and it had to be confronted honestly, or the story that follows makes no sense at all. Their panzer commanders had developed Auftragstaktik, mission command doctrine, to a level of practical sophistication that allowed a junior officer to make consequential tactical decisions in 90 seconds that would require an Allied counterpart to spend 40 minutes on a radio network requesting authorization. Their tank crews trained to a standard of mechanical intimacy with their vehicles that went beyond what most armies expected from mechanics. Their general staff system, the General Stab, conducted a selection and training process so rigorous that fewer than 1 in 3 candidates survived it, and those who did could produce operational plans of genuine architectural elegance under conditions of catastrophic resource pressure. And those conditions were chronic. This is the fact that shaped everything. Germany had been fighting this war under material scarcity since the first year of it. Not the theatrical scarcity of armies making dramatic sacrifices, actual, structural, systemic scarcity. German steel production in 1943 reached approximately 30 million metric tons. which sounds like a commanding figure until you note that the United States produced 80 million metric tons in the same year. German synthetic and natural petroleum availability in 1944, from all sources including conquered Romanian oil fields and the coal hydrogenation plants of the Ruhr, totaled approximately 20 million metric tons. American petroleum production that year reached 1.67 billion barrels, roughly 230 million metric tons. The United States was producing more than 11 times as much oil as Germany's entire military economy could access. 11 times. This was not a gap in degree, it was a gap in kind. And because Germany had always operated within this gap, its entire professional military culture had evolved, with remarkable sophistication, to do more with less. The Vereinigkeit in Heeresdienstvorschrift 300-1, Truppenführung, the command of troops, authored under General Ludwig Beck between 1933 and 1936, and updated through the war, made this philosophy explicit at the foundational level. Where Allied planning manuals emphasized massive material and methodical accumulation, Truppenführung emphasized tempo, decision, and the exploitation of enemy hesitation before he could concentrate. The idea was elegant. If you cannot have more, you must move faster. Strike before the enemy concentrates. Exploit the gap before his reserves close it. Win the campaign in days rather than months, because months require supplies you will never have. The fuel calculation was not a weakness in this system. It was the system's load-bearing pillar, a Panzer IV Ausf. H, the medium tank that formed the reliable backbone of German armored divisions through 1944, had a combat range of approximately 200 kilometers on improved roads and 130 kilometers cross-country on its internal fuel load, a Panther Ausf. G, the technically superior German answer to the Soviet T-34, achieved similar ranges while consuming fuel at nearly 3 liters per kilometer on roads. A Tiger II heavy tank managed 170 kilometers on paved surface, and a punishing 120 cross-country, requiring more than twice the fuel per kilometer of the Panzer IV. These numbers were not secrets withheld from the field. They were published in the Kraftfahrvorschriften, the vehicle technical regulations distributed to every operations officer in the Wehrmacht. What this meant in practice was formal and precise. When a Panzer Division's operations officer, the IA, sat down to plan a thrust, he drew concentric circles on his map. The inner circle represented the maximum effective operational range, assuming optimal road conditions and minimal detours. The outer circle represented the absolute limit, the point beyond which tanks began stopping dead in the road, drained, unable to maneuver or fight or withdraw. Between those two circles was the zone of acceptable risk. Outside the outer circle was not possibility. It was not terrain the enemy could threaten or exploit. It was terrain that did not exist in the operational calculus because no army on Earth, not in 1944, not in any previous war in the industrial era, could sustain armored movement beyond the physics of what its vehicles could carry. General Paul Hauser, commanding the IIS's Panzer Corps in Normandy and one of the most experienced armored corps commanders in the German order of battle, described this calculation with characteristic precision in his 1946 account for the U.S. Army Historical Division's Foreign Military Studies project. He had fought at Kharkov, at Kursk, in the grinding meat of the Eastern Front. When he spoke about fuel planning, he spoke from the authority of 4 years of watching overextended panzer columns die on Russian roads. The radius of a panzer operation was always determined first by fuel, then by ammunition, then by orders, Hauser wrote. An attack that outran its fuel columns was not a bold stroke. It was a gift to the enemy. Pause on that sentence. This is the sentence that defines everything the German system was built to prevent. Hauser was not describing timidity. He was describing professional wisdom, the accumulated wisdom of an army that had watched entire armored corps reduced to static artillery by fuel shortages arriving at the worst possible moment. His arithmetic was not pessimism. It was survival encoded as doctrine. What this system could not conceive of, what Truppenführung itself could not have conceived of, because it had been written in a world where this thing did not yet exist. was an army that did not operate on the cycle of the individual vehicle's fuel tank at all. An army for which the unit of operational currency was not the liter, but the daily ton. An army that was not breathing, filling, exhausting, refilling, but flowing. The German maps were still drawing the circles. The circles were still mathematically correct. They had simply stopped being the question anyone was asking. Part 2. The river that didn't need a riverbed. On August 25, 1944, the first truck convoy of what would become the Red Ball Express departed the supply dumps near Cherbourg, moving south and east toward the advancing Allied front. It was followed by another convoy, and another. Within 72 hours, the system had expanded to fill every available vehicle in the First Army's transportation pool. By the time it reached peak operational intensity in mid-September, 140 truck companies, 5,958 vehicles, were running a continuous circuit between the Channel Coast supply beaches and the forward Army dumps, covering a loop of nearly 700 miles, operating in 2 shifts of drivers around the clock, 7 days a week. The Red Ball Express was not a supply convoy. A convoy implies discrete shipments, a specific load, a specific destination, a finite transfer, and then a pause. The Red Ball Express was a river. It was a material river, engineered and managed by the Transportation Corps of the United States Army, and it operated on a principle that would have been operationally incoherent to any German logistics officer. The trucks did not stop because the tanks stopped. The trucks ran until demand dropped. And when Patton's tanks moved faster than the trucks could follow, the Americans found more trucks. The name itself came from old American railroad culture. Red Ball was railway slang for a high-priority, express freight run, the kind of train that received clearance at every junction and stopped for nothing. The Army adopted the name because it had adopted the philosophy. On its peak operational day, September 25, 1944, the Red Ball Express delivered 12,342 tons of supplies to forward Allied depots in a single day. To feel what 12,342 tons means in operational terms, consider this. The entire German 7th Army, defending Normandy in July 1944, was receiving approximately 1,500 tons of supply per day across all of its logistical channels combined. Food, fuel, ammunition, replacement parts, medical supplies, everything, through a system already stretched to dysfunction by Allied air interdiction. The Americans were delivering to their forward forces on one day more than 8 times what their primary opponent was receiving across every channel simultaneously. The system was operated largely by soldiers of the Army's segregated black service units. Of the 3,000-plus drivers running the Red Ball route around the clock, approximately 75% were African American. Men drawn from transportation and quartermaster companies that the Army had assigned to support roles in a military that still barred black soldiers from most combat formations, regardless of their qualifications. Private James Ruckert of the 783rd Military Police Battalion, who managed traffic flow on the Red Ball circuit through Belgium in September 1944, described the operation in a 1994 interview. Those drivers were the ones winning the war. Nobody talked about it then. But if the drivers stopped, Patton stopped. It was exactly that simple. It was exactly that simple. Here is the core idea, and it is so direct that it took an industrial civilization to believe in it, enough to build for it. The Americans were not supplying an operation. They were sustaining a condition. A German Panzer operation moved forward, consumed its carried fuel, and halted. Rest, resupply, restart. The tempo of combat was the tempo of the supply cycle, a rhythm any German staff officer could calculate, plan around, anticipate, and exploit if you caught the enemy between his inhale and his exhale. Patton's Third Army moved forward and continued moving forward because the supply was not following the Army. The supply system ran independently and continuously, at a pace calibrated not to any specific battle, but to the maximum rate at which trucks and roads and human drivers could maintain throughput. The front line was not the end of the system. It was a moving output point on a conveyor belt that extended all the way back to the Atlantic Ocean. This doctrine had a formal architecture in American Army planning. The continuous logistical support model, developed by the Army Service Forces under General Brehon Somervell, between 1942 and 1944. The theory was precise. In a war between industrial nations, the operative unit of combat power was not the individual vehicle's carrying capacity. It was the daily throughput of the supply system. If you could maintain the throughput, you could sustain unlimited operations. The tank could not carry enough fuel to reach a point 300 kilometers ahead of its current position. But if the supply system could push 400,000 gallons of fuel to a forward dump 100 kilometers ahead of the last dump, and do it again the following day and the day after that, then the effective operational range of the armored formation was not 63 kilometers. It was wherever the trucks could reach in 3 days. The M4 Sherman, routinely dismissed by German tank crews as a mechanical inferior to the Panther, and on a one-on-one technical comparison, they were not wrong, possessed one operational characteristic that German armor could not match on any terms: mechanical reliability at a scale. German Panzer units documented their breakdown rates with bitter regularity. In one operational analysis from June 1944, the ISS Panzer Corps reported that of 46 Panthers available for a counterattack near Villers-Bocage, 17 had broken down in transit before reaching the start line. The Americans lost Shermans to enemy fire at rates that horrified Allied commanders. German commanders lost Panthers to their own mechanical systems at rates that horrified theirs. A German officer looking at an American formation moving through France in August 1944 and counting burned Shermans by the road was measuring something real. He was simply not measuring what mattered. What mattered was the sentence the Germans could not find anywhere in their operational vocabulary. The winning side was optimizing for how many tanks it could put at a given point per week, not how effectively any single tank performed at any single engagement. Part 3. What came from the other side of the ocean? Zoom out far enough from the Avranches crossroads and the picture changes completely. In 1944, the United States produced approximately 1.67 billion barrels of petroleum, roughly 68% of all the oil extracted from the earth that year, by every nation combined. The German war economy, drawing on domestic synthetic production from coal hydrogenation plants and imported Romanian crude from the Ploiești fields, had total petroleum availability of approximately 20 million metric tons from all sources. The United States was producing more than 11 times that volume inside its own borders before a single barrel crossed the Atlantic. This was not a competitive advantage. This was a different order of reality. But raw production is an abstraction until it moves. The physical mechanism that converted American petroleum abundance into armored movement through Normandy was a logistics infrastructure of extraordinary scale, beginning with the refineries of Texas and Oklahoma, running through the Atlantic via tanker convoys, arriving at the port of Cherbourg, captured on June 26, 1944, and receiving operational shipping within 5 weeks, and ultimately flowing through the Red Ball Express circuit into the fuel tanks of tanks, moving at speeds German staff officers had categorically excluded from their planning. The choke point was the port, and the Americans had planned for it with industrial specificity. Brigadier General Robert M. Littlejohn, commanding the Quartermaster Corps of the European Theater, had estimated in pre-invasion planning that sustaining 2 armies in sustained offensive operations in France would require approximately 7 million gallons of fuel per day at the Army level. By August 20, as Patton's breakout exceeded every planning projection, the actual daily demand reached 12 million gallons. The system was running 71% above its design capacity. The Americans did not stop because demand had exceeded projections. They requisitioned more trucks from rear areas, converted engineering units to transport duty, and kept the Red Ball circuit running. The standard 5-gallon jerry can, the fuel container whose very name was a tribute to its original German design, the Kraftstoff canister, which the Allies had copied in 1944 after discovering that their own fuel cans leaked at the seams and crumpled under the weight of stacked loads, was produced by American industry at a rate of 14 million units by the summer of 1944. 14 million 5-gallon cans, carried forward in trucks, transferred to tank crews at roadside dumps positioned along projected lines of advance by logisticians who were themselves moving forward continuously, staying ahead of the front by calculation rather than by reflex. The organizational architecture that made this possible was the Army Service Forces system of Army-level advance depots. Mobile supply points positioned 50 to 100 kilometers ahead of current Army positions, receiving Red Ball Express loads and decanting fuel to division-level supply trains, which forwarded it further to battalion resupply points that traveled with the combat formations. The entire chain from Cherbourg Port to tank fuel cap took between 36 and 72 hours under optimal conditions. The German equivalent system, under optimal conditions that were no longer available, had been taking 5 to 7 days to move supplies from railhead to forward unit. And those railheads were under continuous attack by Allied tactical air forces that had destroyed 74% of French rail capacity by the end of July 1944. Here is the direct comparison that makes the gap feel not like a military advantage, but like a law of physics. On August 12, 1944, as the walls of the Falaise pocket began closing, Army Group B's logistics staff conducted a formal fuel assessment of the encircled forces. Their conclusion recorded in the OB West War Diary for that date. The encircled German armored formations had sufficient fuel to move approximately 50 to 70 kilometers from their current positions. This was the maximum operational energy of the most powerful German force in the Western Theater, calculated to the nearest kilometer by professional staff officers working from real inventory numbers. On the same date, the U.S. Third Army's daily fuel receipt from the Red Ball Express and forward depot system was sufficient to sustain a simultaneous 300-kilometer advance by all 4 of its active corps, roughly 250,000 men and 100 armored vehicles, assuming roads held and drivers kept moving. The roads held. The drivers kept moving. What this meant for German operational commanders was something more destabilizing than simply being outmatched. It meant that their operational category, the mental framework through which they understood the relationship between fuel, distance, and decision, had become historically obsolete while they were still using it. Their circles were still on the maps. The circles were still mathematically accurate. The circles simply described a set of constraints that had stopped governing the behavior of the thing they were fighting. Part 4. What Model read in the reports? Field Marshal Walter Model was not a man who panicked. His nickname in the Wehrmacht was the Fireman. The commander dispatched to situations other commanders had surrendered as lost. He had arrived in the wreckage of Army Group Center after Operation Bagration in late June 1944, and had done what he always did: absorbed the situation, identified the one thing he could still control, and built a defensive line from fragments of divisions that, by every calculation, should have been incapable of defending a road, let alone a front. He arrived at Army Group B in mid-August 1944, replacing the disgraced Günther von Kluge, and began reading him the after-action reports from the Avranches sector with the methodical attention of a man who had been professionally correct about battlefield situations for 4 years. What he read disturbed him in a specific way. Not because the Americans were skilled. He expected that. Not because they had air superiority that was given. What disturbed him was the geometry. The American armor was appearing from directions that, in Model's professional judgment, required a fuel chain that should not have been able to exist. He noted this explicitly in a signal to OPKW on August 18, 1944, captured after the war and translated by the U.S. Army's Intelligence and Historical Section. The enemy's rate of advance suggests a daily supply tonnage that exceeds our calculations of what the available road network could support. Either our fuel calculations for enemy vehicle types are incorrect, or the enemy has introduced a supply system we have not yet identified. His calculations were not incorrect. His supply network identification was simply the Red Ball Express, operating in plain sight 24 hours a day, on roads visible to German aerial reconnaissance, but operating at a scale so far outside German logistical experience that it read as impossible rather than as fact. General Hasso von Manteuffel, who had led the 7th Panzer Division on the Eastern Front, with a reputation for aggressive operational instinct, and who would command the 5th Panzer Army in the Ardennes, described the experience of confronting the American logistics machine in a 1955 interview collected by military historian Basil Liddell Hart for The Other Side of the Hill. We were trained to see operations in terms of what we could carry and what we could sustain over a defined period. The Americans seemed to operate in terms of what they could deliver continuously, as if the supply itself were unlimited. It was a different war. We were playing chess, counting pieces. They were flooding the board. Pause on that image. Manteuffel was not describing demoralization. He was not making excuses. He was a professional soldier of considerable gifts, offering a precise description of the experience of watching a theory of war that his own theory had no instrument to answer. General Heinrich Eberbach, commanding Panzer Group Eberbach during the critical days of the Falaise encirclement, kept a personal diary during the battles of August 1944. The diary was captured by advancing American forces and translated by military intelligence service teams in September 1944. His entry for August 14 reads, "Reports indicate American 4th Armored Division has reached position southeast of Argentan. I cannot account for how they reached this position with operational fuel. Our own columns have been immobilized repeatedly this week by fuel deficits that our logistics officers cannot remedy under present conditions. How the Americans are sustaining these forces is beyond my staff's current capacity to model. How they were sustaining them was 5,958 trucks running without headlights through the Norman night, driven by men whom the Army considered insufficiently suited for combat. There was also a technological escalation in mid-1944 that compounded the mobility advantage in ways German planners had not fully accounted for. American tactical aviation, the P-47 Thunderbolt and P-51 Mustang, operating in close air support, had by August essentially destroyed the German capacity to move supply convoys in daylight. A German fuel column attempting to reach forward units in Normandy during the day in August 1944 was a German fuel column that would be photographed by reconnaissance aircraft within 30 minutes and attacked by fighter bombers within the hour. This forced German logistics onto night movement alone, which cut effective supply throughput by more than 60% by the Wehrmacht's own estimates. The Red Ball Express, by contrast, ran day and night because Allied air superiority made German interdiction of the route effectively impossible. The Luftwaffe that might have threatened it in 1940 or 1941 had ceased to function as a serious interdiction force over northern France by June 1944. For a German panzer commander reading his maps in late August 1944, there was no tactical answer to what was approaching. The answer existed at a level, industrial, national, infrastructural, that no divisional commander possessed the tools to even see clearly, let alone address. His circles were drawn. His fuel was counted. His map showed the world correctly. It was the world itself that had changed. Part 5. The Verdict at Falaise. On the morning of August 19, 1944, soldiers of the 90th Infantry Division, U.S., 1st Army, and the 1st Polish Armored Division met each other at the village of Chambois, France, having converged from opposite directions through some of the most confused and violent fighting of the Normandy campaign. Their meeting closed the last operational gap around what military historians call the Falaise Pocket, a zone roughly 40 kilometers wide and 20 kilometers deep in which approximately 100,000 German soldiers, 400 tanks, 2,500 other armored and motorized vehicles, and the command structures of 15 divisions were surrounded by Allied armies on 3 sides and the river Dives on the 4th. In the days that followed, German forces made repeated breakout attempts through the pocket walls. By the time the pocket was definitively sealed on August 21, German losses recorded by Army Group B's own surviving records included 10,000 dead inside the perimeter, 50,000 soldiers taken prisoner by Allied forces, and 344 tanks and assault guns either destroyed in combat or abandoned on the roads. The abandoned vehicles were not left behind because of mechanical failure. They were left behind because they were out of fuel. Let that detail sit for a moment before the audit begins. The final image of the German Army's finest armored formations in the Western theater is not dramatic, it is practical and quiet. It is tanks beside roads, still, undamaged in many cases. The crews gone, on foot, trying to reach the gap before it closed. The tanks left not because they were defeated in a duel of armor and gunnery, but because the liquid that made them move had run out, and the system that should have brought more had been cut. By air power, by the physical impossibility of threading supply convoys through roads under constant attack, by the simple velocity of an army moving too fast for the fuel to follow. Now the forensic audit. The German commanders who fought in Normandy in the summer of 1944 were right about most things. They were right that the Sherman was technically inferior to the Panther in a direct engagement. A Panther at 800 meters could kill a Sherman frontally, while the Sherman's standard 75 millimeter gun could not reliably penetrate the Panther's frontal armor at any practical combat range. They were right that Allied tactical coordination in the bocage was often clumsy, expensive in blood, and slower than the quality of Allied resources should have produced. They were right that German crew training was superior at the individual tank level. They were right that their operational planning, at the corps level, was architecturally more sophisticated than its American counterpart in the first weeks of the campaign. They were measuring something real. They were not deceiving themselves. The metric they were measuring was individual engagement performance, kill ratios, crew skill coefficients, the technical superiority of specific systems in specific types of encounters. These were the metrics they had refined over 4 years of war, against the Soviet Union, against the British in North Africa, against everyone. On those metrics, they were genuinely correct. The Americans were optimizing for an entirely different metric. They were not counting kills per engagement. They were counting tons delivered per day to forward positions. They were not asking, how effective is this tank? They were asking, how many tanks can we deliver to this theater per month, and how many of those can we keep moving simultaneously? They were not building a military system to win individual engagements. They were building a logistical system to make individual engagement outcomes irrelevant over time, to overwhelm the cumulative capacity of any opponent to replace losses faster than the system could generate them. These two metrics were not simply different. They were, in a profound operational sense, invisible to each other across the divide of doctrine. A German commander examining an American supply dump, the seeming chaos of it, the vast quantities of materiel that German doctrine would have considered wasteful, the fuel cans stacked without the careful inventory that German quartermaster discipline would have required, did not see a weapon system. He saw inefficiency. He saw a culture that had not learned to count. What he could not see, what his training had given him no instrument to see, was that the waste was deliberate, that the abundance was a strategy, that the purpose of not counting every liter was to eliminate fuel as a variable from the battle entirely. This is the philosophical core. The German army had constructed a system of extraordinary precision for winning battles within the geometry of scarcity. The American army had constructed a system of extraordinary scale for making scarcity geometrically irrelevant. These were not different approaches to the same problem. They were answers to different problems being implemented simultaneously in the same physical space. And when a system designed to abolish scarcity meets a system designed to operate within scarcity with perfect discipline, the second system does not merely lose. It loses the capacity to understand the terms on which it is losing, because those terms were written in a language its maps do not contain. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the German commander-in-chief West, allegedly told a visiting OKW staff officer late in 1944, "What shall we do? The Americans have no military tradition. They do not understand war." He was correct in a narrow historical sense. The Americans had not built a traditional military. They had built something a military tradition, in the European sense, would not have recognized as a weapon at all: a continental logistics infrastructure that could pour material forward at rates that made the calculation of individual vehicle range into a rounding error. Every share of this video keeps the names of the Red Ball Express drivers visible for a few more people. Men like Corporal Curtis Brooks of the 39 16th Quartermaster Truck Company, who drove 16-hour shifts in the dark on bombed roads without headlights, without recognition in the press, without the combat decorations that went to the men whose tanks they were filling. The history of the Normandy breakout is written in the names of armored commanders. It was driven by men the Army had decided were unsuited for combat. It compounded in the form of 5,958 trucks running without headlights through the Norman night, sustaining an advance that every German staff map had calculated as geometrically outside the boundary of the possible. It compounded in the form of 14 million jerry cans, manufactured in American factories from a German design that American industry copied because the original was simply better, filled with fuel that crossed an ocean in tankers, unloaded at a port, captured 6 weeks before it should have been needed, forwarded by an army that measured success not in how carefully it counted its resources, but in how continuously it could make those resources irrelevant to the decision. It compounded in the form of a Third Army that consumed 400,000 gallons of fuel in a single September day, and whose commanding general was angry, not at the enemy, not at the terrain, but at the logisticians for falling 100,000 gallons short of what the advance required. It compounded until the German maps, precise, professional, mathematically coherent documents produced by the finest cartographic and intelligence apparatus in the world, showed a situation for which they contained no explanation. Until German after-action reports, filed by serious and experienced professional soldiers who had spent 4 years being correct about war, described American armor appearing from directions that did not exist on their maps. The directions existed. The Germans simply had no word for them. In their language of war, those roads were blank space, terrain beyond the outer circle, outside the zone of operational possibility, the place where armies could not go because armies did not carry enough to get there. The Americans were not carrying. They were flowing.